A desperate mother sings in the streets, not for dreams, but to save her dying son. The world walks past, until Big Shaq stops. What begins as a moment of kindness explodes into a battle against a corrupt system that chooses profit over lives. A child's survival hangs in the balance, a city rises, and Shaq? He's ready to shake the world. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The city had a rhythm, but it wasn't the kind found in music. It was a pulse, a deep thrum that vibrated through cracked sidewalks and rusting streetlights. The neighborhood had seen better days, if those days ever existed. Storefronts sat abandoned, their signs hanging by a single bolt, whispering of businesses that once thrived but had long since surrendered. The people who walked these streets weren't just surviving, they were enduring, pushing forward in a world that rarely noticed their struggle. Shaquille O'Neal, or Big Shaq as the locals called him, moved through the streets with an unassuming presence. At 7'1", he was impossible to ignore, yet he carried himself with the quiet grace of a man who understood more than he let on. He had walked these streets before, maybe not these exact ones, but streets just like them. He knew the weight of being overlooked, of being reduced to a statistic. But he also knew strength, real strength. Not just the kind that let him dominate on a basketball court, but the kind that came from holding people up when they had no one else. His sneakers pressed against the pavement as he observed the world around him. A group of teenagers loitered outside a bodega, their laughter masking the uncertainty in their eyes. A mother clutched her child's hand a little too tightly as she passed a man slumped against a brick wall, his belongings stuffed into a torn plastic bag. Every corner told a different story, but the theme was the same: people just trying to make it through another day. Then he heard it. A voice, raw and unfiltered, wove through the city's noise like a thread of silk in a pile of broken glass. It wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was something else, something that stopped him in his tracks. Shaq turned his head, following the sound until his eyes landed on a woman standing near the entrance of a subway station. Her clothes were worn, her hair unkempt, but her voice carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just singing. She was pleading, her voice heavy with a sorrow that latched onto the heart. The words were simple, but their meaning was deep, too deep to be ignored. People walked past her, barely sparing a glance. Some looked uncomfortable, some just indifferent. The world had conditioned them to keep moving, to pretend they didn't see, because acknowledging meant caring, and caring meant responsibility. Shaq wasn't like them. He couldn't be. He moved closer, watching as she cradled an old coffee cup in her hands, hoping for loose change. A few coins clinked inside, but it wasn't enough. Not for what she needed. Her voice wavered, but she kept singing, as if stopping would mean accepting defeat. Something in Shaq's chest tightened. He had seen desperation before, but this wasn't just desperation. This was survival. And no one seemed to care. The city had a way of swallowing people whole, spitting them out like they never existed. But he wasn't about to let that happen, not to her. The murmurs around him grew, soft conversations laced with judgment and pity. Some whispered about how she should find a job. Others speculated on her past, throwing out words like addiction and bad choices. They didn't know her story, but that didn't stop them from shaping it in their minds. Racism, classism, and 1,000 invisible walls kept people like her stuck in a place they couldn't escape. It was easier to blame the struggling than to admit the system was designed to keep them there. Shaq felt his fists clench, not in anger, but in frustration. He knew what it was like to fight against expectations, to prove you were more than what the world assumed. He had the means to help her, but this wasn't about throwing money at a problem. This was about something deeper, something broken in the way people looked at struggle. The woman's voice faltered for a moment, her eyes darting around as if searching for something that wasn't there. Hope, maybe. Someone who saw her, really saw her. And Shaq did. The city's noise returned. The honking horns, the distant sirens, the idle chatter of people who were too busy to care. But to Shaq, they were all just background noise. The only sound that mattered was the one voice singing against the weight of the world, a voice on the brink of being silenced. He wasn't going to let that happen. The automatic doors of the mall slid open, letting out a gust of chilled air that smelled of cinnamon pretzels and polished tile. Shaq walked in with the kids at his side, their excited chatter bouncing off the high ceilings. For them, this was more than just a trip to the store. It was a moment of belonging, a break from the weight of their everyday struggles. But before they could take another step, a figure emerged from the side, stepping directly into their path. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was firm, laced with authority, but Shaq recognized the underlying tone beneath it. Suspicion. Mr. Caldwell, the head of mall security, stood tall, his crisp uniform unwrinkled, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His eyes weren't on the kids. They were locked onto Shaq, measuring, evaluating, assuming. The kids fell silent. Their excitement vanished in an instant, replaced with a tension Shaq knew all too well. He could feel their small bodies tighten beside him, the way they looked at each other, uncertain and embarrassed. They had seen this before. Shaq inhaled deeply, keeping his expression calm. "Something wrong?" he asked. Caldwell's posture stiffened. "I need to know what's going on here." Shaq glanced at the kids and back at him. "We're heading to the store, just grabbing some shoes for these young men." Caldwell's gaze flickered over the group, skepticism etched into every line of his face. He wasn't convinced. "Are they with you?" Shaq felt the shift around him. Shoppers slowed down, pausing mid-step. A few whispered to each other, glancing over their shoulders. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken assumptions. "They're with me," Shaq confirmed, his voice steady. "That a problem?" Caldwell hesitated. The kids shifted nervously. One of them, Jamal, dropped his eyes to the floor, his hands gripping the hem of his shirt. Shaq could see the old reflexes kicking in. Shrink down, don't make eye contact, don't cause trouble. It infuriated him. Caldwell exhaled sharply, adjusting the radio on his belt. "We've had some incidents recently. Large groups moving through the mall, making disturbances, just being cautious." Shaq chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Large groups, huh?" He gestured around. "Plenty of groups in here. Families, teens, folks shopping together. But you singled us out." Caldwell shifted on his feet. "I didn't say." "You didn't have to." More people had stopped now, watching the exchange unfold. Some with mild curiosity, others with quiet understanding. Shaq knew this moment well. A black man with kids in a store, immediately under scrutiny. It didn't matter that he was famous. It didn't matter that he had money. The assumptions came first. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and thick. Caldwell wasn't sure how to proceed. Shaq wasn't giving him the reaction he expected. No raised voice, no aggression, just unshakable calm. Then, from the side, a voice cut through. "Is that Shaq?" A woman holding shopping bags peered over, recognition lighting up her face. Someone else whispered, "Yeah, that's Big Shaq." The energy shifted. A couple of people took out their phones. Shaq wasn't just another tall man with kids anymore. He was somebody. Caldwell noticed the shift, too. The weight of public scrutiny settled on him, making him adjust his stance. Shaq met his eyes. "So, are we good? Or are you going to explain to these kids why they're being stopped for no reason?" Caldwell hesitated. He knew he had lost. With a curt nod, he stepped aside. "Enjoy your shopping." Shaq didn't move right away. He let the silence stretch, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. Then, with a slow nod, he placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder and led the kids forward. As they walked toward the store, Shaq glanced down at them. "Y'all good?" Jamal nodded, but his voice was quieter than before. "Yeah." Shaq sighed. He wished he could tell them this was the last time they'd face something like that. But he knew better. And so did they. Shaq sat on the edge of a park bench, the cool metal pressing against his skin as he watched the woman from a short distance. The melody of her voice still hung in the air, but now it felt heavier, less like a song, and more like a plea wrapped in music. She stood near the subway entrance, swaying slightly as she sang, her hands trembling as she held out a small, dented coffee cup. A few people tossed in loose change. Others ignored her completely. He had seen desperation before. He had seen it in the eyes of kids who knew their next meal wasn't guaranteed. He had seen it in mothers stretching a single meal to feed their children. But this was something deeper. This was a battle being fought in silence. After a few moments, the woman's voice faltered, her body sagging forward as though the weight of her world was pressing too hard against her. She stopped singing and pressed the back of her hand to her forehead, closing her eyes for a brief second before kneeling down to gather her few belongings. That was when Shaq stood. He walked over, his footsteps light despite his size, careful not to startle her. She didn't notice him at first, too busy stuffing the few coins she had collected into a worn-out purse. It wasn't until his deep voice rumbled, soft yet firm, that she looked up. "What's your name?" She blinked, hesitation flickering in her eyes before she answered. "Renee." Shaq nodded, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "Renee, I heard you singing. You got a powerful voice." Renee exhaled a shaky breath, her fingers gripping the strap of her purse tightly. "Thank you," she murmured, though there was no joy in her voice. Compliments didn't feed her son. Shaq glanced at the cup she had been using to collect change. There was barely enough for a meal, let alone something bigger. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm, the way someone spoke when they truly wanted an answer. For a moment, she didn't respond. She looked away, as if debating whether she should say anything at all. Then, finally, she swallowed hard and whispered, "My son is sick." Shaq felt the words hit like a gut punch. She lifted her eyes, and he saw it. The raw pain, the exhaustion, the kind of fear that only a mother who was running out of time could understand. "He's only 6, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sickle cell anemia. It's getting worse." Shaq inhaled sharply. He had heard of it before. A brutal disease, one that attacked from the inside out. The hospital. They won't treat him without more money up front. Renee let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Charities are full. The system doesn't care about people like us. They see a black mother with no insurance and they tell me, 'We're sorry. There's nothing we can do.'" She sucked in a sharp breath, her hands shaking. "So, I sing." The words lingered between them, heavy and suffocating. Shaq's mind spun back to his own childhood. He remembered the nights his mother worked extra shifts, the way she hid her exhaustion behind a smile. He remembered being a kid, lying awake at night, knowing that money was tight but pretending it didn't bother him. But this was worse. Shaq took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "How much do you need?" Renee flinched, shaking her head. "I'm not asking for a handout." "I'm not offering one," Shaq replied smoothly. "I just need to understand the fight you're up against." She hesitated again, then sighed, her shoulders slumping. "The treatments, they cost more than I can make in a year." Her voice cracked. "I've been turned down for financial aid 3 times. The hospital keeps saying my case isn't urgent enough to qualify for special funding. But he's getting worse. He wakes up crying in pain. And I can't do anything but sit there and hold him." Shaq clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. A 6-year-old boy, suffering, because a hospital had decided he wasn't urgent enough? Because money mattered more than a child's life? His mind raced with possibilities. He could cover the costs easily. But that wasn't the real issue. If he cut a check today, there would still be another mother tomorrow, another child caught in the cracks of a system that didn't care. Money wasn't the answer. This was about something bigger. Renee wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself. "I don't know what to do anymore. I keep thinking, maybe if I sing louder, someone will listen." Shaq's chest tightened. Someone was listening now. "I want to meet him," he said. Renee's eyes snapped to his. "Why?" "Because I need to see him," Shaq said simply. "Because maybe together, we can figure something out." She hesitated, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But there was none. Just a quiet determination, the kind that made it clear that Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just offering charity. He was offering something more. Hope. For the first time in a long time, Renee nodded. And just like that, Shaq knew. This wasn't just a woman singing on the streets. This was a battle for a child's life, and he wasn't about to let her fight it alone. Shaq sat in the dimly lit waiting area of the hospital, his massive frame nearly swallowing the chair beneath him. The scent of antiseptic and stale air filled his lungs, a sterile, cold reminder of where he was. The place was eerily quiet except for the occasional shuffle of nurses and the distant beeping of machines monitoring lives that hung in the balance. Across from him, Renee sat slumped forward, her fingers tangled together in her lap, knuckles white from the pressure she applied. Her eyes, sunken from exhaustion, remained fixed on the floor, as if looking up would force her to confront another disappointment. Shaq had seen this kind of hopelessness before. On courts where kids played ball with holes in their shoes, in homes where mothers rationed food to stretch a week's worth of meals into 2. But seeing it here, in a hospital, in a place that was supposed to heal, filled him with something heavier than frustration. It filled him with rage. He exhaled slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Tell me exactly what happened. What did they say when you asked for help?" Renee lifted her head slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "They said my son doesn't qualify for financial assistance." Shaq frowned. "Doesn't qualify? He's 6 years old and he's sick. How does a child not qualify?" Renee let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Because I make just enough to be disqualified from low-income aid, but not enough to actually afford the treatment. They say the slots for urgent cases are full, and the charity funds are exhausted." She took a shuddering breath. "They told me there's nothing they can do unless I can come up with the money up front." Shaq clenched his jaw. He had seen this before. Bureaucratic red tape wrapped so tightly around people that it strangled them. Hospitals weren't supposed to be businesses, but that's what they had become. "What about payment plans?" he asked. "There's gotta be something." Renee let out another laugh, but this one was emptier, devoid of hope. "I asked. They told me I'd have to put down a good faith deposit before they'd even consider setting something up." Shaq felt his frustration coil tighter. "How much?" She swallowed hard before whispering, $30,000. The number hit him like a punch, not because he couldn't afford it. He could cover that amount in seconds, but because of what it represented. It wasn't just about money. It was about barriers, about how the system made it impossible for people to climb out of their struggles. If Renee were someone else, someone with a different zip code, a different last name, would she be sitting here fighting for her child's life? Shaq stood abruptly, running a hand over his head. "Who do I need to talk to?" Renee's eyes widened slightly. "Shaq, you can't just—" "I can, and I will," he interrupted. "Because this is ridiculous." He turned toward the reception desk, his broad shoulders squared, his presence commanding even without raising his voice. The woman behind the counter looked up, startled by the sudden movement of a 7'1" man towering over her. "I need to speak with someone in charge," he said. She hesitated, glancing at her computer. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" Shaq narrowed his eyes. "I don't need an appointment. I need someone who can explain to me why a child is being denied treatment because of a number on a piece of paper." The receptionist flinched at the edge in his tone. She glanced toward an older man in a suit standing nearby, the hospital administrator, judging by the way people moved around him. The man straightened his tie and stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" Shaq turned to him, his jaw tight. "Yeah, a big one. I just found out that a 6-year-old boy is being denied treatment because his mother makes a few dollars over some arbitrary limit." The administrator sighed, already preparing the standard corporate response. "Sir, I understand this is frustrating, but we have guidelines in place for a reason. There are only so many resources, and we have to prioritize based on need." Shaq took a step closer. "Need?" His voice was steady, but there was a dangerous edge to it. "A child is in pain. He needs treatment. And you're telling me it comes down to paperwork?" The administrator didn't waver. "It's a complex system. We do everything we can, but unfortunately we can't help everyone." Shaq stared at him, the words echoing in his mind. "We can't help everyone." That was the excuse. That was always the excuse. But it wasn't about everyone. It was about the one child sitting at home, struggling to breathe, whose mother had to beg on the streets just to have a chance at saving him. He could write a check. He could pay the deposit and get Renee's son treated today. But what about the next kid? And the one after that? How many families were being turned away because of the same rules designed to keep them in their place? Shaq took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. You know what? He gave the administrator a hard look. I want to talk to the board. The man hesitated. The board? Yeah. The people who make these rules. The ones who sit in their offices and decide who lives and who gets left behind. Shaq crossed his arms. Because this isn't just about one kid. This is about all the kids who get turned away because of a broken system. The administrator's mouth opened, but no words came out. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. Shaq glanced back at Renee, who was watching with wide eyes. Then he turned back to the man in the suit. Make the call. The administrator swallowed. I'll see what I can do. Shaq didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply waited. After a long moment, the man sighed and pulled out his phone. And just like that, the fight had begun. The night was silent, but inside Renee's small apartment, the silence was anything but peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that carried fear, the kind that made a mother listen for every shallow breath her child took, terrified that one might be the last. Renee sat on the floor beside the worn-out couch where her son, Isaiah, lay curled up in a nest of thin blankets. His tiny body trembled despite the warmth of the room, and his face was slick with sweat. His breathing was ragged, uneven. Every inhale was a battle, and every exhale sounded weaker than the last. She reached out, running her fingers lightly over his damp forehead. Hold on, baby, she whispered, her voice breaking. Just hold on. Her phone sat on the floor beside her, the screen cracked from being dropped too many times. No missed calls, no new messages. The hospital hadn't changed its mind. The financial aid office hadn't had a miraculous change of heart. And Shaq, he was trying, she knew that, but even he was hitting walls. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing a hand to her mouth to keep the sob from escaping. Then, a knock at the door. Renee's head snapped up. She wiped her face quickly, scrambling to her feet. When she opened the door, Shaq filled the entire frame, his massive presence making the tiny apartment feel even smaller. His face was tense, frustration carved into every feature. He wasn't the easygoing, larger-than-life celebrity people saw on TV. Right now, he was just a man who had been trying to fight the system, and losing. I've been making calls all day, he said, stepping inside. I pulled every string I could. I got in touch with the hospital's top donors, even reached out to a couple of media people to put pressure on them. Renee's heart lifted slightly. And? Shaq exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his head. Nothing. Either nobody wants to get involved or somebody's making sure they don't. Renee frowned. What do you mean? Shaq crouched beside Isaiah, watching the boy's chest rise and fall with effort. His jaw tightened. I mean, something's off. At first, I thought it was just about money, but the way doors are slamming shut, this isn't just bureaucracy. Someone doesn't want him to get treated. A chill ran down Renee's spine. Why would anyone want that? Shaq didn't answer right away. He was thinking, piecing things together in his head. The hospital was a business, sure, but this kind of resistance wasn't normal. Even when he threw his name around, people hesitated. It was like someone was making sure no one helped her. Isaiah whimpered in his sleep, his little hands clenching the blanket. Renee knelt beside him instantly, whispering soft reassurances. Shaq stood. We can't wait anymore. I'm taking him to the hospital myself. Renee's breath caught. But they won't admit him. They will if I make a scene. His voice was steel. If I walk into that ER with him in my arms, cameras on me, live streaming the whole damn thing, they will admit him. Renee swallowed hard. The idea terrified her, but what other choice did they have? She nodded. Okay, let's do it. Shaq moved fast, carefully gathering Isaiah into his arms. The boy barely stirred, too weak to react. They left the apartment, stepping into the cold night. The city loomed around them, indifferent, unaware of the battle they were about to fight. The ER was busy, but not chaotic. Nurses moved quickly, Doctors murmured in hushed voices. No one paid attention to Shaq when he first walked in, not until they realized who he was. Heads turned. A few whispers spread through the waiting area. A security guard straightened up, suddenly more alert. Shaq walked straight to the front desk. "This boy needs immediate care," he said, his voice calm but firm. The nurse behind the desk blinked up at him, momentarily stunned. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" Shaq's patience was razor thin. "He's dying. That's his appointment." The nurse hesitated, glancing at another staff member. Then, just as Shaq predicted, someone intervened. A doctor, middle-aged with sharp eyes and an expensive watch, stepped forward. "Mr. O'Neill," he said smoothly, "I understand your concern, but we have protocols. Without insurance or an approved payment arrangement, we can't." Shaq took a deep breath. "I'm going live in 5 seconds," he said, pulling out his phone. "Let's see how the world reacts to a hospital turning away a dying 6-year-old. The doctor's face paled. "That's not necessary." "Then admit him. Now." Silence stretched between them. The doctor glanced around as if weighing his options. People were already recording. A few reporters, tipped off by Shaq's earlier calls, were standing outside. The pressure was mounting. Finally, the doctor exhaled sharply and motioned for a nurse. "Take them to a room." Renee let out a choked breath, clutching Shaq's arm. "Thank you." But Shaq wasn't celebrating yet. Something still didn't feel right. Isaiah was taken into a room. Doctors moved quickly now, drawing blood, setting up IVs. Renee sat beside him, holding his tiny hand. Shaq stayed just outside the room, watching. Then, a voice came from behind him. "You don't know what you just stepped into." Shaq turned. A woman stood there, her hospital badge clipped to her coat. She wasn't looking at him like a fan. She was looking at him like someone who knew something. "Who are you?" he asked. She glanced around before stepping closer. "Dr. Elaine Carter. I've worked here for 10 years. I know how things work." Shaq folded his arms. "Then tell me, why was a dying kid turned away?" Dr. Carter hesitated. Then, in a low voice, she said, "Because this hospital has a deal with a private insurance group. The less charity cases they take, the more funding they get. Your friend's son? He was just another number they didn't want messing up their statistics." Shaq's stomach turned. "You're telling me they let kids suffer on purpose?" Dr. Carter's face was grim. "I'm telling you that someone up top made sure this boy wasn't treated, and they won't be happy that you forced their hand." Shaq exhaled, trying to control the rage boiling inside him. This wasn't just about Isaiah. This was about power, greed, and a system designed to crush the most vulnerable. And now, Shaq was in the middle of it. Shaq stood near the hospital's glass windows, arms crossed, watching the city move in the distance. Neon lights flickered, cars zipped by, and people went about their lives, unaware of the battle happening inside these sterile walls. The battle wasn't just for Isaiah anymore. It was for every patient who had ever been told they weren't important enough to be saved. Behind him, Renee sat in the waiting area, her hands clasped together, whispering silent prayers. Isaiah had been stabilized, but his treatment was far from over. The doctor had said his condition was still critical, and he would need extensive care. Shaq had spent the last 24 hours pulling every string, calling in every favor, shaking the system until someone listened. But even with his influence, something kept blocking the path. Hospitals didn't just deny children medical care. Not unless there was a reason. And now, he was about to find out what that reason was. Dr. Elaine Carter appeared from the hallway, her face tight with anxiety. She glanced around before walking briskly toward Shaq. "We need to talk," she said in a hushed tone. Shaq nodded and followed her down a corridor, past the main offices, and into a supply room. As soon as the door shut behind them, Dr. Carter turned to face him. "It's worse than I thought," she said. Shaq narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" She pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly before showing him an email thread. The name at the top made Shaq's stomach tighten. Franklin Dorsey, Chief Financial Officer. Shaq stared at the screen. "Who is this guy?" Dr. Carter exhaled sharply. Dorsey controls the hospital's financial decisions. He decides where funding goes, who gets priority and who doesn't. I dug into past financial aid requests. There's a pattern. Almost every case denied in the last 5 years had one thing in common. Shaq looked up. What? Dr. Carter hesitated, then said, the patients were all black or from low-income backgrounds. A heavy silence filled the room. Shaq felt a slow burn of anger creep through his veins. You're saying this hospital is deliberately denying care based on race? Dr. Carter swallowed. I don't have hard proof, but the data speaks for itself. Denied cases like Isaiah's are piling up, and guess what? Families who can't fight back don't make headlines. They just go home and watch their loved ones suffer. Shaq clenched his jaw. He had seen racism in many forms, but this was calculated. This wasn't just about money. This was about keeping certain people out of the system entirely. Dr. Carter scrolled to another document on her phone. And it gets worse. I found an internal memo from Dorsey's office. It says the hospital is in negotiations with a private donor who only funds hospitals that keep their liability ratio low. Shaq's brows furrowed. Liability ratio. Uninsured patients. High-risk cases. Basically people who cost more money to treat than they bring in. The lower the ratio, the more funding they receive. Shaq exhaled sharply, the pieces coming together. So Dorsey is making sure people like Isaiah don't get treated, just to keep the hospital's numbers looking good? Dr. Carter nodded. And he's been doing it for years. Shaq leaned against the wall, rubbing a hand down his face. He had stepped into a fight much bigger than he realized. He could expose this, take it to the media, force the hospital to answer for its actions. But if he did, Isaiah might become collateral damage. Dorsey wasn't the kind of man to go down without a fight. He had power, connections. If Shaq went after him publicly, there was no telling how deep the corruption ran or how far these people would go to protect their empire. Shaq turned to Dr. Carter. If we take this public, will Isaiah still get the care he needs? Dr. Carter hesitated. I don't know. If Dorsey gets desperate, he could find another way to push him out. Hospitals have ways of making things look like policy decisions. Shaq felt trapped. He couldn't just walk away, but he couldn't let Isaiah suffer because of this fight either. Then, he had an idea. Get me everything you have, he said. Every denied case, every document you can find. If we're taking this public, we're not just going after Dorsey. We're going after the entire system that protects him. Dr. Carter nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. Shaq pulled out his phone and dialed a number. When the call connected, he didn't waste time. I need a lawyer. A damn good one. By the next morning, Shaq had a team in place. Lawyers, journalists, activists, people who knew how to fight battles like this. The story broke faster than expected. News outlets ran headlines. Hospital denying critical care to black and low-income patients. Social media exploded. Protests formed outside the hospital. And then, Dorsey responded. A hospital spokesperson issued a statement calling the allegations baseless and misleading. They painted Shaq as a celebrity who was using one case to create unnecessary panic. Shaq wasn't surprised. He had played this game before. That night his phone rang. An unknown number. He answered. A low, measured voice spoke. You're making a mistake. Shaq didn't flinch. That so? This isn't personal, the voice continued. But you're messing with something bigger than you understand. Walk away and your little charity case gets the best treatment available. Keep pushing and... Shaq cut him off. And what? You think you can scare me? A pause. Then a quiet chuckle. This isn't about fear, Mr. O'Neill. It's about knowing when to play the game and when to step aside. Shaq's grip tightened around his phone. I don't step aside, he said. Silence. Then, the line went dead. Shaq exhaled, setting the phone down. He knew what this was. They were trying to shake him, make him second-guess his decision. But he wasn't backing down. Isaiah's fight wasn't just about Isaiah anymore. This was a movement, and it had already begun. The next morning, Shaq walked into the hospital with Renee by his side. They weren't alone. A swarm of reporters followed. Dorsey was waiting. He stood at the entrance, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Mr. O'Neill," he said smoothly. "We should talk." Shaq stared him down. We should fix this." The cameras flashed. The crowd watched. Shaq wasn't sure how this would end, but one thing was clear. This fight wasn't just his anymore, and he was just getting started. Renee sat on the cold steps outside the hospital, her back pressed against the concrete wall, arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her body together. The streetlights above cast long shadows, stretching across the empty pavement, painting a picture of quiet defeat. She had stopped singing. For the first time in weeks, she no longer had the strength to force out another note. What was the point? No one was listening. No one had ever really listened. Shaq stood a few feet away, watching her in silence. Her voice had once filled the city streets, raw and powerful, a melody that had refused to be ignored. But now, that voice had faded, and with it, so had her hope. The city felt different without her song. Even the traffic seemed quieter, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge her surrender. Shaq couldn't let this happen. He had seen people break before, seen them reach that edge where the fight in their eyes dimmed. He knew what that moment looked like, when someone stopped believing that tomorrow could be different from today, and he hated it. He stepped forward, his large frame casting a shadow over her slumped figure. Renee. She didn't look up. Shaq crouched beside her, his voice softer. "You're giving up?" She let out a small, hollow laugh. "I've been fighting every single day, and where has it gotten me?" Her fingers dug into her arms. "My son is still sick. The hospital still sees him as a number. And no matter how loud I sing, the people with power..." Her voice cracked. "They don't care." Shaq inhaled sharply, his hands resting on his knees as he looked out over the city. He understood her pain, but he couldn't let her drown in it. He needed to do something. Something big. Something no one could ignore. Then an idea struck. A crazy, unexpected, reckless idea. But it might just work. He turned to her. "What if I told you there was a way to make them listen?" Renee scoffed. "What? Another press conference? More hashtags?" "It doesn't matter, Shaq. They'll bury this story just like they bury all the others." Shaq's eyes glinted with determination. "Not this time." She finally looked at him, exhaustion lining her face. "What are you thinking?" He stood up, his massive frame towering over her. "I'm thinking we make the world stop." The next morning, Shaq stood in the middle of the busiest intersection in the city, right in front of the hospital entrance. Traffic screeched to a halt. Drivers honked. People rolled down their windows, yelling, confused, trying to understand why a 7'1" legend was standing in the middle of the street, arms crossed, unmoving. Then, Renee stepped forward, and she began to sing. Her voice, hoarse from exhaustion, cut through the noise of the city. It wasn't just a song. It was a call, a plea, a cry for justice wrapped in melody. Shaq stayed beside her, refusing to move. Within minutes, people gathered. Pedestrians stopped. Cars lined up for blocks, unable to pass. News crews arrived, cameras rolling. Social media exploded. Shaq shuts down city streets in protest. Mother's song demands justice. Will the hospital listen? And then, the moment that changed everything. Renee's voice wavered as she sang the final note, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Then, one by one, they began to clap, and then cheer, and then chant. "Let him in! Let him in! Let him in!" The hospital executives, watching from their high-rise offices, had no choice. They had been backed into a corner. Minutes later, the hospital doors swung open. A spokesperson stepped out, forced into making a statement under the pressure of thousands of voices demanding action. "We will be admitting Isaiah for full treatment, effective immediately." The crowd erupted. Renee fell to her knees, overwhelmed. Shaq knelt beside her, steadying her. "You did it," she whispered, gripping his arm. Shaq shook his head. "We did it." And as the world watched, as the city pulsed with energy, Shaq knew. This wasn't just about Isaiah anymore. This was about every voice that had been silenced. And this was only the beginning. The city was never quiet. It pulsed with life. Horns blaring, footsteps pounding against concrete, voices rising in a never-ending hum. But today, something was different. Today, the city wasn't just moving. It was watching. At the heart of it all, standing in front of the hospital's towering glass doors, was Renee. Her back was straight, her eyes steady. Her voice, once filled with exhaustion and despair, now rang through the streets, carrying something new, something stronger. Hope. But this time, she wasn't singing alone. Around her, dozens of voices joined in. Some soft, some loud, some unsteady, but all united. The melody spread like wildfire through the growing crowd, a force too powerful to ignore. Shaq stood beside her, his arms crossed, scanning the scene. The energy in the air was electric. What had started as a desperate mother's plea had turned into something much bigger. This wasn't just about Isaiah anymore. This was about all the people who had been turned away. News cameras rolled. Reporters whispered into their microphones, their voices urgent. Onlookers pulled out their phones, live streaming the moment to millions. Social media feeds flooded with hashtags. Number, let him in number. Healthcare for all. Number Shaq stands with Renee. The pressure was building, and inside the hospital, the people who had spent years bearing cases like Isaiah's were running out of places to hide. From behind the hospital's glass walls, Franklin Dorsey watched the chaos unfold. His hands clenched into fists. This was spiraling out of control. "This is getting out of hand," a board member muttered beside him. "We have to do something." Dorsey's jaw tightened. He had spent years crafting the perfect system, one that kept the hospital's financials in check while ensuring only the most valuable patients were treated. But now, in a matter of hours, all of it was crumbling. He turned sharply to his assistant. "Get the PR team on this. We need to control the narrative before it." But before he could finish, a nurse burst into the room, her face pale. "Sir, it's already out." She turned the TV on. A news anchor's voice filled the boardroom. "We have just obtained leaked documents showing a disturbing pattern of medical discrimination at this hospital. Sources confirm that high-ranking officials, including Chief Financial Officer Franklin Dorsey, deliberately denied treatment to low-income and uninsured patients, prioritizing profit over human lives." Dorsey felt the blood drain from his face. The truth was out, and the world was watching. Outside, the crowd grew louder. The song that had started with Renee had become an anthem, echoing down the streets, past the high-rises, through the screens of millions watching online. A chant followed. No more denials, no more lies, no more kids left to die. Shaq glanced at Renee, seeing the tears welling in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from something else. Relief. For the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. Then, the hospital doors opened. A man in a suit stepped out, flanked by security. The cameras zoomed in. Franklin Dorsey's face was pale, his forehead slick with sweat. He adjusted his tie, then cleared his throat. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice forced and rehearsed. "This hospital will be reviewing all previously denied cases and implementing a new policy to ensure that financial status does not determine a patient's right to treatment." The crowd roared. Renee covered her mouth, her breath hitching. Shaq exhaled slowly, his fists unclenching. But Dorsey wasn't done. "I would also like to personally apologize to Ms. Renee Williams and her son Isaiah," he continued stiffly. "His treatment will be fully covered by the hospital, and we will ensure he receives the best care possible." Renee's knees nearly buckled. Shaq caught her, steadying her as she let out a choked sob. They had won. But more importantly, they had changed something. As the city stood still, watching history unfold, Shaq knew. This wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of something bigger. The steady rhythm of a heart monitor filled the hospital room, each beep marking another second that Isaiah was still here, still breathing, still fighting. The fourth line ran from his small arm to the machine beside him, pumping life back into his frail body. His chest rose and fell in slow, even motions, a stark contrast to the ragged, painful breathing that had once kept his mother awake at night. Renee sat beside his bed, fingers gently brushing against his tiny hand. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't counting pennies, wasn't begging strangers to listen, wasn't holding her breath waiting for the worst. Her son was going to live. She turned to Shaq, who stood near the window, his massive frame almost too big for the room. He had been there for hours, leaning against the wall, watching over Isaiah like a silent guardian. The weight that had pressed against his chest for days had finally eased, but he wasn't celebrating. Not yet. "You okay?" Renee asked softly. Shaq exhaled, running a hand over his head. "Yeah," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. "Just thinking." She studied him. "About what?" Shaq sighed, crossing his arms. "About how messed up it is that we had to go this far to save one kid." Renee's throat tightened. She had spent so long in survival mode that she hadn't even stopped to process what they had just gone through. "If you hadn't stepped in," she murmured, "Isaiah wouldn't be here." Shaq shook his head. "That's the problem. It shouldn't take someone like me, a name, a platform to make people care. This fight shouldn't have to be a fight at all." Renee looked away, staring at the heart monitor. "But it is a fight," she whispered. Shaq nodded. "Yeah. And this was just one battle." Outside the hospital, the world was still buzzing. The protest had ended, but the movement had only grown stronger. Social media was flooded with posts about Isaiah's case, exposing hospital corruption and calling for policy changes. Activists picked up the momentum, demanding that financial barriers to healthcare be eliminated. And then, there was Renee. She hadn't planned on becoming a symbol. She had only been a mother fighting for her child. But her voice, the same voice that had once been drowned out by the noise of the city, had become something else entirely. A rallying cry. Her song, captured in shaky phone recordings from that day in the streets, had gone viral. People all over the country were listening and singing along. News stations played clips of her voice rising above the city, calling it the song that changed everything. Musicians remixed it, protesters sang it in front of government buildings, and strangers thousands of miles away sent messages of support. For the first time, Renee's voice wasn't just a plea for help. It was a symbol of resilience. But with change came resistance. Shaq knew it wouldn't be long before the people in power fought back. The hospital's board released a statement announcing reforms to their financial aid system. But Shaq wasn't buying it. It was damage control, a desperate attempt to smooth things over now that they had been caught. Dorsey had resigned, but Shaq knew men like him never truly disappeared. They just moved to different offices, changed their titles, and kept pulling the same strings from the shadows. "They're gonna wait for the world to move on," Shaq said as he and Renee walked through the hospital corridors later that night. "Once the noise dies down, they'll go back to business as usual." Renee tightened her grip on her jacket. "So what do we do?" Shaq stopped walking. "We don't let the noise die." She looked up at him. "I'm not just talking about the hospital," Shaq continued. "I'm talking about every family like yours. Every kid like Isaiah. Every mother who's ever had to beg for basic human decency. The system isn't broken, Renee. It's working exactly the way it was designed to." She swallowed hard. "Then we need to redesign it." Shaq smiled, a small, knowing grin. "Now you're thinking like me." 2 days later, Isaiah was strong enough to sit up in bed. The color had returned to his cheeks, and he no longer looked like a shadow of himself. When he opened his eyes fully, the first thing he saw was his mother. "Mom?" His voice was small but steady. Renee choked back a sob, cupping his face in her hands. "I'm here, baby." Isaiah blinked up at Shaq, his little face scrunching in confusion. "Are you the basketball guy?" Shaq let out a deep laugh, the sound rumbling through the room. "Yeah, little man, that's me." Isaiah frowned. "You're huge." Renee and Shaq both laughed this time. Isaiah looked around the room, his eyes landing on the IV in his arm. "Am I getting better?" Renee's smile wobbled. "Yeah, baby, you're getting better." Isaiah let out a relieved sigh, then mumbled, "That's good," before his eyes fluttered closed again. Shaq watched as Renee brushed her fingers through her son's curls, humming softly. The same voice that had once cried out in desperation now carried something different: peace. But as Shaq stepped out into the hallway, his mind was still restless. Isaiah had been saved, but how many others wouldn't be? How many more mothers were still out there, singing their own desperate songs, waiting for someone, anyone, to listen? Was this a victory? Or was it just the first step in a battle far from over? Shaq didn't have the answer. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done fighting yet. And neither was the city. Some stories end. This one is just getting started. How many voices are still out there, waiting to be heard? How many lives hang in the balance, ignored by a system designed to leave them behind? If this story moved you, imagine the ones we don't see. It's time to pay attention. It's time to stand up. Because change doesn't happen in silence.